You guys have such nice and pretty backgrounds. And then I have my auto collection on the wall.
It's unique that way, though.
Hello, everyone. My name is James Jackson Jr. I'm with the Utah Black Chamber of Commerce. Thank you for joining us today. As we all know, language has a significant effect on those around us. So today's conversation will be focused on learning how to create cultivative language that intentionally avoids marginalization and encourages inclusivity. Joining us today, we have Nubia Pena, Director of the Utah Division of Multicultural Affairs. So we'll be moderating this discussion. Joining her will be Jason Thompson, Krystal Guerra, and Neelam Chand. And I won't steal their thunder. I'll allow them to introduce themselves their own way. So, Ms. Pena, take it away.
Thank you so very much, sir. I appreciate the introduction or the brief opportunity to introduce ourselves. I want to begin by acknowledging our host, the Salt Lake Chamber, for the invitation to moderate today's panel. My name is Nubia Pena, and I'm the Director for the Utah Division of Multicultural Affairs. And it is my pleasure to join our expert guests as we explore why language matters and how it can serve as a tool to create inclusive and welcoming environments. So to start us off, I would like to invite that each of our panelists provide a brief introduction of themselves. And if I can please have Neelam begin, followed by Jason and Krystal.
Thank you, Nubia. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Neelam Chand, and I am a founder and CEO of Shift SLC, which is a consulting company here in Utah. Very new consulting company, about 4 months old. And I've been doing diversity and inclusion work for over a decade, and have been doing most of this work in my undergrad, even during school, throughout my education. So this work is very near and dear to me. I have some personal connection to this work, lived experience growing up here in Utah. So I'm excited to be here. I'm excited to talk about inclusive language. I believe that this is the first conversation that needs to happen before you start to engage in conversations around diversity, equity, inclusion, is really level setting and getting on the same page on language and on inclusive language. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Neelam. Jason?
Yeah, good afternoon. Thanks for having me. I'm Jason Thompson. I'm the Vice President for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion for Western Governors University. I have been doing diversity for probably about 25 plus years. I've launched diversity programs in 4 different industries. Probably the one that most people care about is I built the diversity program for the US Olympic team. Also invented a way to measure diversity for the Olympic sports. It was recognized #1 innovation in diversity a couple of years ago. And then hopefully if things go well, my book will come out in April. I was asked to write a book on how to launch diversity programs since I've done it so regularly. But other than that, I'm happy to be here and thanks for inviting me.
Thank you so very much, Jason. And we look forward to hearing more about the book when we ask about resources at the end of the panel. So thank you. And Krystal.
Yes, thank you guys so much for having me as well. My name is Krystal Guerra, and I am a Utah native. I'm the Director of Demand Generation at Instructure, and also have an opportunity to sit on our Diversity, Inclusion, and Belonging Council for North America. I've worked a lot with the Latino Hispanic community here in Utah with co-founding the Utah Latino Business Expo, and also had an opportunity to produce and direct a documentary focused on immigrant farmers and a lot of my family's story, which my parents have always been farmers. My dad's a full-time commercial farmer. And so inclusion and diversity work is something that's always been near and dear to me, kind of echoing what Neelam said earlier. And it's great to be here, a part of this conversation.
Excellent. Thank you so very much, Krystal, and to each of you for joining it. And once again, we want to share how much we appreciate your commitment to advance these efforts. And so really to start right away and dive into the content for today's panel, I would ask that you each share your thoughts about why language is so important in crafting an inclusive environment. And also if you could share tangible examples of how you have seen language be used to exclude or isolate people. And Jason, I'd like to begin with you.
Sure. For me, I think one of the things we've always tried to do is encourage people to be good listeners. I think a lot of times what happens is when somebody brings up things that are uncomfortable, we try to fix it too quick instead of listening, validating what we're hearing. But words can be very, very, very powerful. So one of the things we've done is at WGU is really include the word equity so that people realize that our diversity work is intentional for how we look. Equity is important on how we treat each other, and our inclusion is why you stay and why you want to come back. And so throughout our work, one of the things we do is we validate the fact that we know some people are going to be uncomfortable. That's going to be part of our process. And then I think if we can really focus on being good listeners and validating what we hear, you're more apt to hear things that may make you uncomfortable, because many times our natural inclination is to move away from it. So we've been in the program I'm currently building with WGU is very heavily focused on just consistency of message, because I think words make people really uncomfortable, that they're so worried about saying the wrong thing. So within that, one of the ways to overcome that is consistent training so that you get more comfortable with it. The analogy I use is, if you take a calculus class, you don't learn it in the first 15 minutes. The vocabulary is new, you're going to say the wrong thing. But if you can get people comfortable with coming back to calculus class, you can build a diversity program. It's kind of the same concept. That's what we're hoping to do. Is it's complicated words you might not be familiar with. But the more we can get you familiar with it through that consistency, hopefully we'll overcome that and people can be better at communicating.
Thank you, Jason. So Neelam, for you, why would you think that crafting an inclusive environment requires us to be mindful of the language that we're using, the way we're referring to one another? And again, I invite you to share if there have been ways that you have seen how language has been used to exclude or isolate folks.
Yeah, I really like what Jason said, that language is powerful and the words that we use is powerful. And there's gonna be a lot of background noise. I have a baby, I've got someone at the door, I've got people living with us. There's a lot happening, so just ignore that. But I believe that language and inclusive language is what bonds us together. And like you said, could exclude us and separate us and isolate us. So it's important to know what you're saying, why you're saying it, and being careful in how you use language because it is so powerful. And so I personally have seen, I've actually taught around inclusive language. And I've seen in my trainings, I've seen language being used to either protect themselves, protect people who are feeling defensive, or language to potentially maybe even hurt somebody, or maybe even to validate themselves and their superiority in that space. So I see that it could be really harmful. I see that it could really minimize people's experiences. It's very powerful. And if it's not used correctly, and if you're not thinking about what you're saying, you could really do some damage. You can do some damage in relationships. You can really change the whole dynamic in a space. So I just echo, and I love what you said, Jason, about language being powerful, words being powerful.
Thank you, Neelam. And Krystal, the same to you, inviting you to share why you think that being mindful of language is critical for our organizations, specifically work culture. Why do we need to be careful and cautious and inclusive with the use of language?
Absolutely. I think it speaks volumes to the type of environment you're creating and the ability to foster relationships amongst people. For me, inclusivity really comes down to respect, a lot around connection and community. And so if you're not being respectful of other people's space, it really makes it challenging for people to show up as their authentic, full selves. And that's something that over the years, I've been in tech for over 10 years now. And, as one of the few Latinas that, in tech here in Utah, it's something that speaks volumes to me from a culture value standpoint. And something that I look for in the workplace is how can I show up being comfortable, being my full self, and adding and contributing to the conversation if I feel like that inclusivity language isn't happening and that's not an environment that we're ongoingly fostering. So it really comes down to respect for me in that sense.
And Krystal, yesterday, as we were preparing for this panel, we talked a little bit more about how we need to consider language beyond the spoken word. Can you tell us how you've used that approach in your work and why you think it's important for us to be mindful of that as well?
Yeah, for sure. So I'm a marketer. I've been in marketing for over 10 years. I absolutely love it. And so often I feel like a picture is worth 1,000 words. And when you're in the space of marketing, it is not only the things that you're speaking about. And in fact, one thing that's interesting is that most of the communication that we have with each other is actually nonverbal. And so it's only about that 7% that is actually verbal spoken word. And so for me, imagery is so important. We've seen this across the media. We've had examples. One of my favorite examples of nonverbal communication is from the movie Pretty Woman, where she's on Rodeo Drive. She comes into a shop, right? And you instantly feel kind of the energy in the room when she goes to that store, and there's body language happening of prejudice and judgment that's being had. And so I think so often it's important that we're conscious and intentional about our nonverbals. There's been various brands that have been hurt from being tone deaf, and a lot of that again wasn't necessarily spoken word. It was, H&M is a perfect example. Imagery that they used in some of their apparel. We had the big Pepsi campaign that came out with a video, and so I think so often people forget that it's often the nonverbals, it's a lot of that imagery and branding that speaks to the values that you have as a company. And that leads me to speak to then the leadership, right? The tone at the top that's being set. And if we're comfortable having these things out in the public this way, then I can only imagine the conversations that are happening in the board meetings behind closed doors. And so it does kind of speak to not just the importance of the spoken word, but again, so much of those intangibles that do speak volumes about a culture.
Great, Krystal. And so that leads me to Jason, especially as Krystal talked about how this is a value setting. It really comes from how is leadership consuming and ensuring that your organization believes in inclusive language, not only in spoken, but also, as mentioned, nonverbal. So how do you operationalize this work, Jason? In your organization, you've done this now for 4 different industries. How do we make this work tangible, approachable, and something that people can take back to their businesses, their companies, and say, we can do this. We can create shared language, inclusive language through internal and external practices.
Yeah, there's a lot of good points there. I wish I was smart enough to answer all that, but there's a few things. One of the things I always tell people is audio should match video. So as an organization, if you say, hey, we're committed to diversity, equity, and inclusion, there's a simple equation that every employee does. Am I paid fairly compared to my peers? That's just fundamental to any organization. And every organization can do that, because I guarantee you, when you find I'm paying $20,000 less than the person sitting next to me, loyalty's gone. And right immediately, I know audio does not match video. They say they're committed to diversity, equity, and inclusion, but my paycheck doesn't reflect it. That's a very powerful message you can send to your employees. If you're committed, it's a simple thing everyone can do. Like just, you go back to your office and you should see, hey, are we really paying people fairly? And that should be something that's done regularly. And to me, that's just a fundamental piece of any kind of diversity program. That's an easy way to show there's commitment, because in that case, you say you're committed, you want to treat people fairly. And if they see that represented, it doesn't mean everybody has to have this high paycheck or high salary. It just means I don't want to find out that I'm so poorly paid compared to the people next to me. And so that's a simple tool that everybody can take to their workplace today. The other piece is very individually, I think people forget. A lot of large corporations do this. When you're a hiring manager, you're given a window, right? I can pay people within this window. And generally what we say is we pay within the 50th percentile. And as a manager individually, one of the things I always say is, we know women have historically been underpaid. All the data shows that. You could simply say, we know women are paid 6% less than men. I add 6% to that 50 percentile as a manager when I make the offer. Then you could actually be correcting it individually. We don't have to wait for the company to make it right. Most managers have that much leeway. The data shows women only apply for jobs which they're 100% qualified for. You're actually doing the right thing. Like that just lines up the diversity things that we already know. And so there are simple things that all of us have individually. There's things that the organization can do that, and a lot of it is just that fundamental thing of saying audio should match video. And when we say we're committed to diversity, where is it in the organization? When we say we're And one of the exercises I take a lot of companies through is to say, look at your mission statement, and what are the behaviors you can see in your organization that show you're committed to diversity in the behaviors, not just in what you say, but if I walk around the office and you say we're about equity, if I were in a wheelchair, could I actually negotiate the office? Because that shows inclusivity in a very simple way. So there's simple things that you can do to show audio matches video.
Great. Thank you so very much, Jason. And especially as we're talking about audio matching visual, recognizing that that experiment, that exercise of being able to make sure that our websites, the vision, the mission is very clearly accessible, not only to those who are viewing us, but for those who work for us. So thank you, Jason, for that example. Neelam, I want to turn to you because you mentioned that, you've done a lot of work around the inclusive language work and getting people to think about this. How can people also operationalize? So similar question to Jason, how can people operationalize this work?
Yeah, I really like and echoed everything that Jason said, but I also think that when organizations start diversity, equity, inclusion work, I think the first thing they need to do is they need to ask themselves why they care. And then they actually need to put that in writing. And it needs to come from a very vulnerable, very authentic space. You see all these organizations, making statements, especially, while the Black Lives Matter movement has sort of amplified. You've seen all these organizations use language, use word to say that, hey, we are in alignment, we're in solidarity of the Black Lives Matter movement. But what we're seeing is as we're unfolding these organizations and as we're seeing what's behind the curtain, so to Jason's point, really kind of walking the walk and talking the talk, you're seeing that there is not a lot of action behind some of these words that are being used. So I think what organizations should do is they need to take a step back. They shouldn't just put out a statement just because they feel like, oh, it's the moment, we got to do it. Otherwise, we're going to be held under fire. But really take a step back and find out why you care about this work. Why does your organization care about this work? Why you as individuals, all the folks here, why do you care about this? And actualize it and turn it into a written piece or whatever that may be. And then that will then become your value statement. That will then become sort of the parameter of the types of language you're going to do, the types of culture you're going to foster within an organization. So to operationalize it, I feel like that's the first step, is really figuring out why you care about this and then turn it into real tangible language to help build parameters on what your culture is going to look like.
But for a lot of people who are trying to dive into this work around diversity, equity, and inclusion, many of them are sharing that there's fear that is surfacing because they don't know the language or they're afraid that they might say the wrong thing. So what would you say, or how would you advise people who are trying to navigate that fear and still want to show up? What would you advise them to do?
Yeah, so fear is really interesting. So I feel like fear is one of the biggest barriers to having and engaging in these conversations. Fear, knowledge, and bias kind of work together and kind of stop people from having these conversations. But let's think about the emotions that come up when we make a mistake. So let's kind of go to the worst case scenario. We make a mistake. We're talking to somebody, we make a mistake. They call us out for that mistake. First things probably that happen, we feel embarrassed. We're probably feeling mortified. We slowly get into ourselves and center ourselves in these spaces. We want to move to a different country because we never want to see this person again, because we never want to look dumb again. And we really just kind of get into this space where we strive for perfection. We want people to perceive us as perfect. So the moments that we make a mistake and we get called out for it, it's just not a good experience. And I think that's because in America, and when we think about white, cis, straight, male, dominant culture, in these spaces, perfectionism is sort of the center of all these spaces. So we all subscribe to wanting to be perfect. And the moments that we are getting called out for mistakes, and the moments that people notice that we're not perfect, we then turn into ourselves and start beating ourselves up for it. So that's my long answer to say, get over yourself, because it's not about you. When there's all this fear, the fear is coming from striving to, to really foster that perfection culture. We need to move past that and really kind of foster a culture of feedback and be okay with giving each other feedback. So lean into that fear. It's legitimate. I'm not saying that you shouldn't be afraid, but I don't think that that should stop you from having these conversations. So I tell people to get over themselves. I tell people that it's going to be uncomfortable. I tell people you're going to make mistakes. Everybody makes mistakes. You're not perfect. No one's a robot. And to come into these conversations with your whole human self and know that you're going to get called out and you're going to make mistakes, and it's not going to always feel like, roses all the time. So I guess it's some tough love. That's kind of what that's kind of what it boils down to, is tough love.
I am so curious, Jason and Krystal, about your approach. So Neelam is going to take a tough love approach. And what would your approach be, or what would your advice be for people who are, again, afraid of navigating the fear, but that genuinely want to show up, but they're scared of saying the wrong thing? What would you advise them to do? Krystal?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I definitely, to some extent, with what Neelam said, can relate to that, and think some of it is getting out of your own way. These conversations do require a lot of self-reflection and self-accountability, which is something that I think as humans we struggle with in general, right? Whether it's a fitness journey, something you're trying to improve on that way. Self-reflection and accountability requires ownership. And I feel like oftentimes that is hard for people to accept. And I feel like it does get a little bit worse when you're going up the chain in terms of job titles. So when you're looking at a manager versus a director versus a C-suite title, there's going to be more pressure to make sure that you're living up to all of the leadership, expectations there. So I think that, to some extent, vulnerability in leadership needs to be looked at as a strength. And that's something that I know I've worked to implement with my teams and across teams, is to say, yes, I may be a leader in this position, but at the same time, I also come with my own lens of bias. And so really helping disarm people from the get-go and saying there's going to be times where I'm not always going to be right and I'm not always going to be correct. And so I am relying on you guys to help me learn and for us to learn together and kind of grow together. And so just kind of like said, disarming, people in that sense. One of my favorite sayings is always that your ego is not your amigo. And so I have told my teams that many times, and getting out of your own way, because at the end of the day, it really is about fostering an environment where people feel comfortable in showing up. And so if you're setting the precedent that there's going to be repercussions for people genuinely being inquisitive or asking questions, then that is setting up yourself and your team for failure, not only when it comes to inclusivity and conversations there, but really just in general and in avoiding groupthink. So I think that's kind of one way I would approach it.
Thank you, Krystal. So Neelam's tough love, you're a little bit more on the compassionate side. You're inviting people to bring their whole self here. Okay. I love that there's various ways of doing this work. Jason, Krystal also mentioned vulnerability. So I would invite you to talk about both things. How do we navigate fear? How do we move beyond that? But then also, how do we recognize that this work requires us to be vulnerable? How does that have any place in this work?
Yeah, I think really Krystal hit the nail on the head when she said be vulnerable. I think that's a very powerful thing. And Neelam made a lot of good points. And in fact, I'm sorry, Neelam, did I pronounce your name correctly? Neelam, is that correct?
Yep, that's right.
Thanks. And that's all you have to do, what I just did. Like many times we make this way too complicated. I wasn't sure. I check in. We should just model that behavior. Sometimes we make this way too complicated. You're going to say things you wish you hadn't. But if you're not sure, you just ask. Neelam has a unique name. I'm not familiar with it. All I had to do is check in. Did I pronounce it correctly? You know what? We make mistakes all the time. And the other analogy I tell people is, don't ask me to organize the Davids. And what does that mean? For instance, I have some friends who go by David and some people who go by Dave. Now, if I said, what I'm going to organize the Davids and the Daves, and we're going to have a national convention. And at this national convention, they're going to have a vote and they're going to have to decide, are you Dave or David? And then everyone's going to go by that. They have to choose one. Now, fundamentally, you would say that's ridiculous, Jason. No one's ever going to do that. But we want Black people to do that. We want our Latinx friends to do that. It's like, is it Black or is it African American? It's so complicated. I can't remember. Why can't you just decide? And if you think about it, we don't ask Daves and Davids to do it. Why would you assume I can organize every single Black person on the planet or every single Latinx person on the planet? The fact is everybody's unique. They'll have their own choices, how they pronounce their first name, just like how they pronounce their last name, or whether it's, you know, how they want to identify themselves. It is complicated. You're going to say some things you wish you hadn't. You know, that vulnerability is a great thing to model, you know, as a leader. Yeah, you know, sometimes I just didn't get it right. I just own it. I always try to remind people, like, as a person of color, it's not like I'm just waiting to jump on people. Like, I'm just hoping you call me the wrong thing so I can just call you out. Like, it's not like that's how we live our lives. I mean, the reality is we know people are going to say things they wish they hadn't. I say things all the time that I wish I had not. But I think if we just kind of find this place where you just own it when you make a mistake, it's going to happen. You're vulnerable to that. And I do think there's a good point that Neelam made, which is get over yourself. The fact of the matter is, you know, you're going to have to do that. And it isn't unique. If you think about it, we do this all the time. I have some friends that are Dave. I have some friends that are David. And somehow people remember that. Oh, that's Susie, not Susan, right? We even correct each other. But somehow with issues of race and gender and identity, we act like it's too complicated. We actually are very skilled at it already. You know, and that's why I started with trying to confirm, Neelam, is that the correct pronunciation of your name? If you think about it, people do that all the time. We have this skill. You just have to apply it in this space. It's the same fundamental concept.
Thank you, Jason, especially because you're giving us some practical ways in which we can model the behavior within our own spaces, our workspaces, as well as our personal and interpersonal ones. So I appreciate those practical applications. So Neelam, you know, the tough love approach also brought the intersection of vulnerability and recognizing that some of us, we make mistakes, right? And for many people, it might be helpful for them to know that even us as a diversity, equity, and inclusion advocates, and those that are in the work every single day, there are things that we can do to pause and consider our use of language. Would you be willing to share an example of how maybe in the past you have used language that caused harm and maybe unintended impact, and how did you navigate that?
Yeah, so I had mentioned earlier that I've done inclusive language trainings and different trainings. And I did this one training around sort of gender bias and inclusive language around gender. And I went through this whole spiel about saying words like you guys and, you know, using gender coded language in meetings. And then literally right after that, so here I am preaching, letting people know, the expert, literally moments after that, I'm like, okay, guys, next. And then I didn't recognize until someone called it out and they're like, oh, you literally just said guys. And I'm like, oh, and at that moment, now I could have done, you know, I could have shut down and I could have just said, you know, I probably could have just gone in my head and just stopped the whole meeting and walked out of the room. I mean, there's a lot of things I could have done. But instead I said, you know, I'm sorry. I apologize. I apologize the fact that here I am telling you all that this is, we need to foster an inclusive space by using inclusive language and making sure that we're being inclusive in terms of gender and race and ethnicity and the way we talk to each other. And then I quickly revert back to what I have consistently done in the past. So I apologized and then I moved on. I didn't dwell on it. I didn't beat myself up for it. I realized that I have a lot of learning to do and I have a lot of practice because I know when we tell folks to change language or change the way you say something that you've always said, it does take time. So there is a level of grace. And as much as I'm all about tough love and get over yourself and, you know, get on with it, I also agree that these things take time and that we need to allow some grace and allow and understand that people are coming from a vulnerable place and they're trying to do better. So so I just moved on from it. I learned from it and I try not to use that. I say y'all instead of you guys. So that's a specific example and it was very recent, by the way.
So again, right, the fact that we're all on this journey. And what I appreciate that you just shared right now, Neelam, is that you said you guys. That was one of the things that we can replace, right? And so Jason and Krystal, I'm going to invite you both to share as the conversation around equity, inclusion, and diversity develops and people want some tangible things that they can apply. What are some communication strategies that we should consider replacing or adopting? So are there specific words or engagement strategies that we should be mindful of to no longer use? So Neelam said, guys, right? That could be exclusive, maybe using instead leaders. Jason, I'll start with you. What are either specific communication strategies or words that you would encourage us to replace or to use in place of?
Yeah, I wish I was that smart. I'm still working on guys. I say it all the time and I'm trying to drop it because it's such a bad habit. The thing I've been working on is pronouns and using pronouns that are respectful, that a person chooses. But one of the things I've done actually just, and I wish it was my idea, it isn't, just even in my writing, like many times the pronouns aren't actually necessary. And so it doesn't always need a gender pronoun. You can actually use their name again. And I try to, and the reason I'm doing that is so I can actively in my mind be respectful of the use of pronouns and the pronouns that a person might want to use. And it's a simple thing, but it helps validate, someone else's reality. Instead of me judging whether or not, they can use the pronoun they, I just try to use it more in sentences so it becomes more natural to me. And believe me, I screw it up all the time. But I think just being more intentional about trying to be respectful of another person's pronoun and how they might want to use them, I think is important. There's a lot of words that do have gender bias or privilege reflected in them. And what I've worked more on is not so much the words, but being a good listener when someone calls me out on it. That to realize, what, this is a very good point, and try to be a listener, because I think that's actually the skill that's going to help you long-term. There are all kind of words that are out there that have a gender bias that we don't realize, or contextually. And when you use it in that certain space, it has a different connotation. And there isn't a simple rule. It's complicated, that many times some people can use it, other people can't. You think about it, honey might be something you call your spouse, but you don't just approach anybody on the street with it. Context is important. So there isn't always, simple rules that we can follow. But the one thing you can do is be a good listener when someone, expresses that, try to validate a different reality that maybe you're not familiar with. That those are the behaviors I think can help us the most long-term.
Thank you, Jason. So how about you, Krystal? Are there any specific language or any specific words, I'm sorry, that you would encourage us to think through before either continuing to use them or really to consider the impact of what happens in our cultures when we do utilize?
For sure. So one that I really is a big pet peeve of mine that I see a lot in headlines, and again, just speaking from the marketing angle, is avoiding qualifying words that reinforce stereotypes. And I work in education, to work for Instructure. We're the makers of Canvas. We have a very diverse community of students, learners from all over, and oftentimes I've seen headlines where it'll refer to students as a group of intelligent Black students, or for me being Latina, I am proud of my heritage, but I'm a great marketer, just in general. And so using some of those qualifying languages, it's interesting that oftentimes we see a lot of those words associated when it comes to communities of color and people of color. And so I would just be really mindful of avoiding the need to qualify or pre-qualify and saying she's a female CEO or she's a woman CEO, and because we don't have those qualifiers across the board for other groups. So that's a big one. I think also just being mindful of pick list options. So anytime I've created surveys or sent out feedback surveys, in avoiding, Jason talked to a little bit about privilege and kind of avoiding those superiority pick list options where you're saying non-white, meaning, using kind of white as the standard. And so I think there are things like that when you're looking at, workplace situations of areas to improve upon, for sure. Slack channels, that's a big one. If you're in the tech space, that's what we use at work as kind of our IM system. And so being mindful of the labels that you use for some of those group chat conversations. So those are a few things personally tried to be mindful of and making sure I'm not using and would recommend to people in creating some of those descriptions and things like that.
Thank you so very much, Krystal and Jason, especially because you're talking so much about the fact that there's such beautiful opportunity for growth and learning together as we try to correct some behavior that might be creating exclusion. Neelam, I wanted to ask you, especially in our preparation meeting, the use of language that has a deficit frame, and Krystal talked a little bit about that, but is there anything else that we might be able to replace? So again, we start to recognize the wealth and vibrancy of diverse communities. Any language that you might encourage us to no longer use?
Yeah, I mean, we kind of talked about this behind the scenes, but we talked about use of minority that's directed towards people of color. It's interesting because again, we're talking about the power dynamic that Krystal had mentioned. You say minority and majority. Minor is in the word minority, majority is in the word major, or major is in the word majority. And so you're creating this deficit power play where people of color are sort of at the deficit end of it. So replacing minority with, either underrepresented. I'm not a big fan of marginalized, but I think that's a little bit more appropriate. The other thing is, a lot of companies, when they talk about hiring people of color or hiring people with different identities, they talk about lowering the bar. Kind of making the assumption that we're not going to find people of color in these Ivy League schools. So now we have to lower the bar, and we have to, kind of make it a little bit easier for people to get in. And that's not the case. That's just, again, a deficit way of looking at it. People everywhere from all aspects of life with different identities bring in so many different values into an organization. So instead of lowering the bar, it's really about expanding qualification and expanding the way you look at the way you're hiring and where you're hiring from. But when you say that we're lowering the bar, you're saying that, and again, this is very specific to people of color. You're saying that people of color are just not qualified. They're just not educated enough. So I think those are, real quick, sort of very common languages that are used that are sort of in the deficit space. And so, I would try to refrain from using that. The other thing that I see come up, and it doesn't really go into the deficit space, it kind of goes into the microaggression space, but I get this a lot, and I think this is a very common question, but asking people who are people of color, asking them where they're from. And I get that. I think a lot in Utah, there's a lot of curiosity of where people are from. And so it seems like an innocuous question, right? It seems like it's, you're just curious about someone, you're just trying to get to know somebody. But when you ask that question to a person of color, you're insinuating that that person does not belong here. They don't look like the white norm. Or the standard that Krystal was talking about. Therefore, they don't belong here. They must be from a different country. There's something different about them that's not the norm. And white counterparts don't get asked that question. It doesn't always happen. Krystal, you.
Yeah, I was going to say, I would just kind of love to chime in on that. It's funny, one thing that I noticed that I started doing that I didn't notice I was doing until I kind of self-reflected as to why I did that. I would tell people where I was from, and I would say, I'm from Utah, and people always, I got the kind of like the side head, like, but where are you really from? Because we know, like, you kind of look different, and so it was like they were waiting for the and additional sentence. And so I got in the habit of introducing myself and saying that I'm from here, but my parents are from Mexico. And I didn't realize that had become such an innate part of my introduction because it had become a learned behavior from being in that situation so many times. And so it's just interesting how you kind of pick up on those things. And to echo your thoughts earlier, the term disadvantaged is another one that comes to mind. For me, I knew that my home life was different, but I never associated that with disadvantaged until I got to college. And I went, they did an exercise and they were the take a step forward, take a step back. And so it is important that we don't plant those seeds early in students as well, because it does have long-term effects in how then they might start reflecting and seeing themselves that way. Because again, I knew that my home life was different, but I never considered it as a deficit in that way.
Or the other one is you're really, you're really articulate. Again, seems like a compliment. Seems like it could be a really nice thing to say to somebody, but when someone gets, and mind you, these are things that people say over and over. It's compounded. It's not just a one-off. So one person asking me where I'm from throughout my whole life wouldn't bother me. But if it happens 2 or 3 times a week for my whole life, you better believe I'm going to get sick of it. So, so even saying that you're articulate, I mean, that's happened so many times. And it goes back to that deficit thinking that people of color are just not articulate. They're not educated enough. They're not competent enough. And so I think these types of languages, this type of language only reinforces the stereotypes and the prejudice that are out there.
Thank you, Neelam and Krystal, for sharing not only your own personal truths around how you have experienced the use of language that can make you feel excluded, but how we might be more mindful of the use of disadvantage, minority, asking certain questions that really are microaggressions. And, we really invite our audience to learn more about that. There's different types of microaggression, different levels, but the impact is nonetheless harmful. So Jason, I want to turn to you and explore this idea of when we see people using language that's harmful, how can we hold each other accountable in a compassionate way, but ensuring that we disrupt harmful behavior? And I really wanted to turn to you because I appreciated that you modeled some of that when you shared your story about your misuse of pronouns, or how potentially you are still learning in that path. So what could we do, and how could you advise people? How do we hold each other accountable?
Yeah, well, there's a lot there. I think one of the things that I think is important, and lately I've been moving away from using this term safe spaces, because I feel like what it does is imply somehow if you talk about race, it's unsafe. It's not true. And in fact, you can be safe and uncomfortable at the same time. Like, we'll have an uncomfortable conversation, but that doesn't mean it's unsafe. And I think that term actually starts to equate this fear of difference or fear of people of color. And so you don't need a safe space. You're going to have an uncomfortable conversation, which you've probably had before in your life. But the fact of the matter is, we keep using those kind of terms, we're actually creating this equation that's not true. And so that's one of the places I think we need to start is, if you're defining it that way, you've already created this negative environment that we're going to talk about things that are unsafe. So we're going to create a safe space. And, you're reasserting this stereotype that somehow people of color are unsafe. So you don't need a safe space. You will have an uncomfortable conversation, and that's normal. And so I think even the terms we use. But the other thing I try to remind people is there are different ways to address behaviors. And so I always tell people, you can address or you can fix. And most issues around race cannot be fixed, at least not in that first 15 minutes or in the next 45 minutes. But a lot of them do need to be addressed. So if someone says something offensive, depending on who you are in that room, it may need to be addressed in the sense of as simple as, that's inappropriate. Or it could be a question that you could just follow up with a question. Well, it's an interesting comment. I'm not sure I understand it. Can you explain? And many times people start to have to explain something like that. It becomes very apparent what's going on and they catch on. But I always tell people you have to respond in the context of who you are and what you feel comfortable with. Some people are very, it's your personality. You're going to be very upfront. And that's how you want to deal with it. That's fine. But if you're not that person, you shouldn't feel guilty. There's different ways. Sometimes it's just a good question is all it takes. Sometimes it might be because of my position, I have to call it out, but you don't have to fix it. I think people usually get hung up. They're like, well, I don't know how to fix it right now. And you're not going to be able to fix it. Like I always tell people, it took me 50 years to become all the biases that I currently carry around in the world. You're not going to undo them in 15 minutes. You're not going to undo them in the next 3 sentences, right? It's going to take time and it's a process. But if I do something inadvertently wrong, I do think, and it's offensive and you noticed it, you could say, well, that's offensive, Jason. Did you realize that? Or, that's an interesting comment. Why would you make that comment, Jason? Like there's different ways to bring it up, but they have to be consistent with who you are as a person. And if you're in a situation where you don't feel safe and you don't think it can be addressed, don't address it. Like you shouldn't feel guilty. Like I get a lot of those things. I feel, I've been doing diversity a long time. I don't fix everything. I don't address everything. Sometimes, it's just, maybe I don't feel safe. today I ain't feeling it. It's been all day. I'm tired of this. I just want to go home. I want this meeting to end. You have a right to those emotions. And I think that's one way we can really start to support each other. Sometimes, guess what? You just missed it. You just don't address it. That's normal too. I think the one thing you have to realize is, who are you in the room? So if you are the leader in the room, you may not be able to fix it, but you do have an obligation to address it. And it's really not even about the person you're talking to. It's about the other people in the room. So they think, the leadership at least said something about this. And so context is important, but sometimes you don't address it. You don't feel comfortable. I think that's fine. It's normal.
Thank you so much, Jason. But you're also bringing up a really important topic around allyship. And now we're also talking about privilege, and we're talking about accomplices. And these are all new terms for some people who are trying to do the work. And it's a journey, and it's an opportunity for many of us to figure out, how can I engage and disrupt and be an active bystander? So Neelam, I'm going to tap you in and ask you, what can people do to be better allies or accomplices in disrupting harmful behavior in their communities or in their workspaces?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is not to let moments just slip and slide, and not to say anything as things are happening right then and there. And I think, to Jason's point, it's not easy, right? Because it depends on the power dynamic within a working place environment. You can't always be the person that speaks up, because you just don't know if there are repercussions for saying what you're going to say. But I think as an ally, it's important that you get other allies and don't do it by yourself. You either use different resources like blogs or videos to send to the person that may have said something offensive. And there's other ways of addressing it than rather than face to face, and calling that person out. But the idea of an accomplice is to take action, and it's to do it right then and there. It's not to wait and to contemplate and to let time go by, because it's important that people, when they make the mistake, at that moment they realize that they made that mistake. Just don't do it by yourself. But we all have a responsibility when we see something going on, and we see that the person that is sort of the person that's receiving, whatever the harm is, the person that's being harmed can't necessarily stand up for themselves, or is not able to address it right then and there. I think it's important for us as bystanders to step in and try to handle the situation with the permission of the person that's being harmed, and making sure that you're checking up on the person that is being harmed as well. So not just focusing on the person that's perpetrating the problem, but also focusing on those that have been hurt, and just not to do it by yourself. I think that we, kind of to Jason's point, I think that we really truly put the pressure on ourselves to have to solve the problem or change behaviors or change people's minds. And I think that's not the point. The point is really to say, hey, there's something wrong here. You're going to need to do your work to correct that. And it's up to you to change your behavior. That's completely on you. But to just make sure that you do say something and not just let moments go by.
Mm-hmm. Well, and that really goes to the type of culture that is perpetuated, allowed, justified in a company and an organization. If leadership is seeing something or witnessing something and doesn't disrupt it, but really it's collective action, and it's going to require each one of us to be willing to engage. So thank you, Neelam. It's also heavy work and emotionally laborious. So thank you, Jason, for noting that sometimes there are days where it's heavy to pick that up. Krystal, I want to turn to you and ask you, for people that are really struggling with this idea of diversity, equity, and inclusion, taking the limelight and being something that is really heavily being discussed across the nation, how do we move beyond thinking that this is about being politically correct? How do we talk about this being that it's not about the intent, it's about the impact? How do we do that, Krystal?
Yeah, absolutely. I love this question. Oftentimes political correctness is referred to as PC, and being PC, I know I don't adhere to always being PC for sure. And I think there is a difference. I think one of the challenges when I think of political correctness is, I read a saying that said political correctness is about looking good, where inclusion is about being good. And I think that oftentimes when people think of PC, it's based on external pressures. And so for me, it's so much more important. It comes back to that authenticity, to that vulnerability of where the intention is coming from, and really getting to the root of help me understand. And when I've had conversations with people and I come at it from a very, again, disarming approach of, hey, can you help me understand? I'd like to learn more. Um, you know, I sometimes don't use the right words, and we had that conversation earlier. I definitely have been in some oops moments with people, and I think for the most part, you can tell when someone's being genuine about wanting to learn more and be part of the solution. And so I definitely differentiate the two. I think political correctness has its place in certain platforms, but for the most part, it's about the idea of wanting to get better and approaching it from kind of that point of view.
So when it comes to people trying to do this work, and as many of you have noted, it's heavy, it's complex. Jason, you've been doing it for several years, and Neelam, you launched your company. There's a lot that exists to help build people's capacity to do this. Jason, where can people find resources to learn more about inclusion, language, and how can people get comfortable with the topic of diversity and inclusion?
Yeah, I think to me, and you've alluded to this, this is a journey. Like, you're not going to get it in the next 15 minutes. And people always ask me, well, it's interesting because it's a good example of bias. People ask me, well, what do you read, Jason? Well, I'm dyslexic. So that disability is in fact invisible. So you wouldn't know it from looking at me. And then if I can't give people a list, they seem disappointed. Like, why don't you have this list? Which is a good example of what privilege looks like. Like, you feel like you can demand from me certain things, and that somehow I couldn't work in this profession if I can't do it the way you defined it for me. But the fact of the matter is, for me, I can usually read short articles that are dense because it's better because of my disability. And so I just have a little thing in my Google email that sends me articles related to diversity every day. You can get them, you can set it for a week or a month or whatever, which is a simple way. And it just has a few code words in diversity, equity, and inclusion, and these articles pop up, which is a simple thing that can be done. But there's also an interesting nuance here that I think we should call out. And that is, many times we look upon people of color to answer this question for us, or people with disabilities to answer this question. And I'm like, we all have access to the internet. If you really are committed to this, all you got to do is get on the internet like the rest of us and start searching things. If you want to make change, like, make it about yourself. People always want me to give them this magic key of, oh, we got to fix diversity, Jason, tell me what to do. I'm like, yeah, work on yourself. And people don't, it's funny because people never want to hear that. But that's actually the only thing we can control in the context of diversity, equity, and inclusion is ourselves, our own behavior, what we learn, what our commitment is. And if you're not willing to do that, we really can't change things on the macro level. Really, what happens at the macro level is a function of what each of us do individually. And so, just get on the internet and do some searches, go to the library and get a book. Those are all things all of us have access to, all of us can do. And then question this assumption we have that somehow a person with disability should explain this to me, like that they're somehow there to entertain you. Like, that premise is something broken in that kind of logic. So that's the things we need to push people to, is like, let's work on ourselves individually. That's really where you can make some very powerful changes.
Thank you, Jason, because I think you're really touching on how it begins with us, right? Leading with inclusion, it's on us. It's on each and every one of us to decide that we're going to do the work, that we're going to show up. I will invite folks to visit the Multicultural Division's website. We have a page that has an entire list, a glossary of language that can help build more equitable and inclusive spaces. But again, as Jason mentioned, diversity, equity, inclusion, inclusive language, lots of different things will show up on Google. So we invite you to do your work as well. We have a few minutes left, but Krystal, I wanted to make sure that you had a chance to share. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, outside of the resources, one thing I always tell people as well is get yourself friends that don't look like you and don't come from your background. So I'm so thankful, in my conversations, oftentimes I get compliments of people that share, oh, you don't seem like you're from here. And I know what they're alluding to, and I'm always thankful that I've had a diverse group of friends and coworkers and leaders that I've had a chance to either work with or have personally reached out to. And I feel like that makes such a big difference. And oftentimes, you can only read so much about push-ups and getting abs, right? And at some point, it's where the rubber meets the road, and it's expanding your circle of influence and the people that you spend the majority of your time around. That's where you're going to learn and have some of those fail forward moments. But I would just encourage people to, be amongst people that don't just come from their same socioeconomic background and their cultural background. And especially in Utah, it's very, very much needed.
Thank you, Krystal. Absolutely. The idea of being able to build community and redefine what community means. Who are we sharing space with? Who are we engaging with? And developing those interpersonal relationships can really make a difference. Thank you, Krystal. So with the very last few minutes that we have together, what I would invite that each of you do to close this out, acknowledging the lift and the challenge that this work presents, what would you say or what would you share as an invitation for people to keep showing up and diving in? So Neelam, I'll start with you.
So I'll just put on my tough love hat and just say, it's be okay with being called out, because it's going to happen. And sometimes it could be really harsh. We can't control how people react to things, but still take it in, because there's a reason why someone is calling you out. Decenter yourself and your feelings. Don't make this about you. So when you are getting called out, don't invert and get into sort of, oh my goodness, I'm a bad person, oh my goodness, I'm embarrassed, oh my goodness, I need to change my whole life and move to a different country. Don't do any of that. Really think about the harm that you caused and the impact that you had on the people who are calling you out, and then sort of get rid of this idea of wanting to be perfect or needing to be perfect. Challenge that as much as you can. So the moments that fear starts to settle in, think about it. Is it because I am wanting to be perfect and I don't want this person to see me as a flawed person? Get that mindset out of your thinking, and really truly pay attention to your actions and what you're doing. I think that really opens up your mind to learn more. So those are my parting words.
Thank you so much, Neelam. Jason?
Yeah, I think just real quickly, commit to a journey. The fact of the matter is it's not going to be easy. It's not going to come fast, but you got to show up every day, commit to it, and you're going to be uncomfortable. It's like anything else. First day of calculus class is uncomfortable. Anytime you learn something new, it's uncomfortable. There's nothing wrong. Stay in that space and could just continue to grow. Commit to the journey.
Thank you, Jason. Definitely flex those racial justice muscles. Absolutely. And Krystal, how about you?
I'll just kind of end with, if it's going to be, it's up to me. And I love MJ's Man in the Mirror song. It really does start with yourself and being mindful and intentional, intentional, self-reflective. And so to echo Jason's point earlier, it starts with us, and all of us contributing together is what will make our communities overall more inclusive of others.
Thank you so much, Krystal. All right, well, we want to be mindful and respectful of people's time, and we know that hour went by too quick, and there's so much more here that we could keep diving into and unpacking. But we do hope, as Jason mentioned, that you continue on your journey, that you stay committed to understanding how your influence, your power, and your privilege has an opportunity to create meaningful change, create spaces that are inclusive, that are welcoming, and that everyone, regardless of race, gender, ability, creed, whatever it might be, that they feel like they belong wherever it is that you are sharing space with them. So with that, I thank the Chamber for being able to prioritize this conversation. We do hope that we have an invitation to continue the dialogue, and we thank you again for your commitment to join us. Have a great night, everyone. Thank you. Thank you to our expert panelists. Thank you.